In the 12th year of the Qinghua era, there is a street in Beijing called Chessboard Street, located within the city walls near Zhengyang Gate. This street was bustling with people from all walks of life, from officials to merchants, creating a lively and prosperous atmosphere. Curiously, amidst this bustling scene stood a shabby fortune-telling shop, completely out of place. The shop was in poor condition, with no sign to speak of. On either side of the door were two couplets. One read, "Do not do unjust deeds. Above your head, 3 feet have God's watching," while the other said, "Good and evil will be repaid in the end, only differing in when it comes." The calligraphy was wild and free, almost clumsy, yet strangely had a certain rugged grace. Inside the shop, the decor was even simpler, just a wooden table and 2 straw mats. Beside the table, a fortune-telling banner leaned against the wall, with the phrase, "He who knows his fate does not worry," written in large characters. No one knew when this nameless shop opened. The neighbors were all puzzled by its sudden appearance, as if it had sprung up overnight on Chessboard Street, boldly setting up business under the very shadow of the royal palace. The shop's owner made a living by fortune-telling, but he also had another talent. He could hear injustices. It was said that he was born with double pupils, allowing him to see into both the physical and spiritual realms. He could hear the grievances of spirits. If a family had an unjust death or if a case remained unsolved, they could turn to him, and he would immediately know the truth. It sounded mysterious, but very few believed it. For one thing, the man was young, and he didn't have the aura of a celestial being. For another, he looked disheveled, not resembling a wise, otherworldly sage at all. Because of this, the shop's business was dismal, and the place was often empty. Fortunately, the owner had a carefree nature. He didn't mind at all. Every day, he opened the shop on time, closed it on time, and when customers came, he'd offer few divinations. When no one came, he would take a nap in the shop, living quite leisurely. Over time, people in the neighborhood became familiar with him. "Hey, if you're looking for nonsense, it's just up ahead." If the fortune teller overheard, he would stand at the door, flick his long robes, and dramatically correct them. "No, no, no. I am Hu Shua, with the courtesy named Ba Dao and the nickname Mr. Wild Words. This young lady, are you here for face reading, divination, or fortune telling?" "My young miss wishes to draw a fortune stick," the girl wearing a veil spoke, though the words came from the maid in the green dress standing beside her. "Oh," Hu Shua thought to himself, puzzled. Why would this lady come to him for a fortune stick instead of going to a temple or a Taoist shrine? He glanced at the woman more carefully. She was wearing a light yellow short robe with a cross collar, a lake blue embroidered skirt, and a pinkish-red half-sleeve jacket over her shoulders, with a long, 5-colored tassel at her waist. The tassel was tied into a beautifully intricate shape, resembling a butterfly with wings poised to take flight. She wore a beaded veil hat, and the delicate gauze hanging down covered her face. Hu Shua's eyes flickered. The woman's clothes and accessories, though simple, were clearly of exceptional quality. She must come from a prestigious family, either the daughter of a wealthy merchant or a beloved pearl from an official's household. A young lady of such status wouldn't want to go to a temple for a fortune stick, most likely to avoid being recognized and attracting gossip. It seemed to Hu Shua that she was asking about a matter of love. Without pointing it out, Hu Shua smiled and invited the lady to sit down. Then, after rummaging through his bulging cloth bag, he pulled out a fortune stick and handed it to her. The lady extended her slender, delicate hand, hesitated for a moment, and then slowly drew a stick. Hu Shua took the stick from her, glanced at it, and smiled without speaking. The maid, unable to contain her impatience, spoke up. "Hey, will you say something? Can't you even tell what it means?" "Humph, I bet you're just a scam artist." "You chow. Do not be rude," the lady scolded lightly, her voice as clear as pearls. Hu Shua was unbothered by the maid's words. He laughed, stroked his non-existent beard, and then leisurely spoke. "Miss, this fortune stick is neither good nor bad. It's a middle-of-the-road one. The writing on it is a poem from Jiang Xingyu's Yumerin. He held up the bamboo stick, revealing a few lines of text. The young man listens to the rain in the tower, the red candles dim in the gauze curtain. In youth, he listens to the rain aboard a boat, with vast rivers, low clouds, and a lone wild goose calling in the western wind. Now, he listens to the rain beneath the monk's temple, his hair graying with time. The joys and sorrows of life are indifferent, and the rain keeps falling, unceasing until morning. "Please, Mr. Hu, how should this be interpreted?" the lady asked. "Joy and sorrow are indifferent. Miss, what you seek will most likely lead to disappointment. There is nothing to be gained. Only retreating is possible, but no progress," Hu Shua said, his tone measured and meaningful. Just like in this Yumerin poem, it speaks of the tragic end of Consort Yu at Gaixia. "If you advance, you will perish. If you retreat, the sea is wide and the sky is open," he added slowly, his eyes carrying a hint of deeper understanding. The lady fell silent, lowering her head, her face still hidden by the veil, making it hard to read her expression. After a while, she rose, thanked Hu Shua, adjusted her veil, and left in a hurry. The green-dressed maid shot Hu Shua a glare and dropped a silver coin before rushing to catch up with her mistress. Hu Shua weighed the silver in his hand. The lazy smile on his face suddenly faded. Watching the two figures retreating into the distance, his eyes flickered with a trace of concern. For the next month, the nameless shop remained eerily quiet, with not a single customer in sight. Even the owner of the tavern next door couldn't bear to watch this any longer. He wandered to the door, curious to see whether the so-called master, with his grand claims of great ability, was still alive or had simply given up. Upon peering inside, to his surprise, he found the fortune-teller sitting alone at the table, engrossed in a game of chess, playing against himself. At times, he frowned in concentration, and at other times, he clapped his hands and laughed aloud, thoroughly enjoying himself. "Still playing chess? With business in such a pitiful state, aren't you worried about starving to death?" The tavern owner couldn't help but comment. "What's meant to come will come," Hu Shua replied without even lifting his head. The next day, an unexpected client arrived at the shop. The eldest daughter of the Minister of Revenue, Li Shilang, had suddenly fallen ill and died in a tragic and inexplicable way. Her family was worried that it might be due to a problem with the family's feng shui, which had brought misfortune upon their house. They wanted to hire Hu Shua to come and inspect the Li family residence. As a fortune-teller, Hu Shua was skilled in a wide range of arts: fortune-telling, divination, physiognomy, everything one might need. His expertise also extended to feng shui, both for living homes and tombs. Without asking many questions, Hu Shua stood up and made his way to the Li family's estate. However, when he arrived, the guide didn't take him to the house's exterior to examine the feng shui, but instead led him directly to the inner chambers. Li Shilang, the minister, was seated at the head of the room, his face grim. His wife sat beside him, equally somber. Several concubines stood around, their faces uncertain, each lost in their own thoughts. It was said that the deceased daughter, named Hida, was the most beloved of the minister's children. She was as beautiful and virtuous as her name suggested, a model of grace, intelligence, and elegance. Just past her 15th birthday, she had already been promised a chance to enter the palace for the imperial selection of concubines. Yet, in a cruel twist of fate, she had died suddenly, leaving her family devastated. People murmured that she had been a victim of heaven's jealousy for her beauty. Hu Shua performed the customary condolences and sat down in the lower seat. He picked up a cup of tea and leisurely waited for the family to speak. "Oh," he murmured as he sipped the fine green tea. It was fragrant and smooth, with a lingering aftertaste. Hu Shua swallowed slowly, raising an eyebrow. He had caught something odd in Li Shilang's words. "So, you're saying your daughter died of suicide?" "Exactly. The rumors are dangerous, so we told others it was a sudden illness to avoid scandal," Li Shirlang said, his eyes glancing cautiously at Hu Shua. Hu Shua leaned back, still holding the teacup, and calmly asked, "If it was a suicide, then why call me here?" "I've heard that you possess extraordinary skills, that you can hear the grievances of spirits." Li Shirlang trailed off, half believing, half unsure of what to say next. Hu Shua's eyes lazily met his, but for an instant, a strange feeling lingered in the air. It was as though, in the depths of Hu Shua's black pupils, another set of eyes, an unseen presence, was watching them both in eerie silence. The pressure in the room was palpable, and suddenly, Li Shirlang slapped his thigh in realization. He couldn't contain himself any longer, blurting out, "Master, the house is haunted." The young lady of the Li family had hanged herself in the back garden. After her burial, strange events began to unfold. First, a night watchman reported seeing an eerie green light coming from the garden, which was completely out of place. Then, a maid who had been awake in the middle of the night saw a figure with long, disheveled hair standing behind a tree, staring at her. Terrified, she fainted on the spot. In the days that followed, many in the Li household, including Li Shirlang himself, claimed to have seen a ghostly figure resembling the late daughter. The figure was always the same, dressed exactly like she had been in life. Same height, same build, same attire. As panic spread through the household, and fearing that word would get out and reach the emperor's ears, Li Shirlang desperately sought out Hu Shua to investigate. Several witnesses described the ghostly figure in great detail, but Hu Shua, as usual, wore his trademark relaxed expression, giving nothing away. He didn't immediately announce that he would catch the ghost or uncover the truth behind the supposed spirit. Instead, he simply asked to see the deceased lady's private quarters. Li Shirlang was busy with official matters, so his wife led Hu Shua to the room instead. They passed through much of the estate, through winding corridors, and as they moved deeper into the house, the surrounding greenery thinned, and soon there were no more flowers in sight. Only the faint scent of flowers lingered from Li Shirlang's wife. In the shade of tall trees, a small two-story building stood half-hidden. It was the former private room of Hida, the deceased. Hu Shua stood at the door and glanced around before stepping inside. Before he did, he asked, "Who is the maid that served the young lady closely?" "Only one. Her name was Yu Chao. They grew up together, and the bond between them was deep." "Please send for her," Hu Shua said simply before entering the room on his own. Li Shirlang's wife did not follow. She turned to leave, presumably to avoid the painful memories. The room was simple but refined. An ancient guqin lay on a low stool, and a half-finished embroidery of flowers rested on the frame. The table was covered with calligraphy and ink, along with some scrolls, many of which were dedicated to the texts Nu Zhe, the rules for women, and Nu Jie, the instructions for women. Hu Shua bent down to examine them. One of the sheets had several scattered ink stains, much fainter than the other markings on the page. Suddenly, there were soft footsteps behind him. Turning around, Hu Shua was surprised to see that the maid, Yu Chao, from the previous visit to his shop, was standing there. He had a sharp memory and a keen eye for details. He instantly recognized her. She and her mistress were particularly noticeable, so their faces had left a deep impression on him. "Yu Chao," Hu Shua murmured. "So the lady who died was your mistress?" Hu Shua sighed, turning his gaze toward her. "You were the one pretending to be the ghost, weren't you?" Yu Chao trembled, her head hanging low, her fingers tightly twisted together in anxiety. Hu Shua remained unfazed, but his voice softened slightly. Those who saw the ghost all described it as looking exactly like the deceased young lady. "I was suspicious at first, but now seeing you, I'm more certain of my guess." Yu Chao raised her head, a mixture of fear and confusion in her eyes. "There are no ghosts in this world. If something appears to be a ghost, it's just someone pretending. Only someone who was close to the lady, who knew her well enough to mimic her appearance, could have pulled this off." Hu Shua smiled faintly. "That butterfly knot on her dress, was that yours?"
"Such a unique knot.
"I doubt anyone else in this household could have tied it." "You Chao," Hu Shua continued, his tone hardening. "Tell me, why did you pretend to be a ghost?" Yu Chao trembled and stared at him for a long time, her gaze filled with indecision. Finally, with a soft thud, she dropped to her knees. "Master, my young mistress has been wronged," she cried out, her voice full of sorrow. She was murdered. The rumor of the ghost haunting the Li residence, though intentionally hidden, eventually leaked out. The public was in an uproar, and the gossip grew wilder with each passing day. It was said that the daughter of the minister Li had died under suspicious circumstances, transformed into a ghost, and lingered in the house to seek justice. There were even claims that a fortune-teller from a nameless shop could see the ghost and hear its words. He had been summoned to the Li residence to hear the ghost's grievances. People, always eager for a bit of drama, gathered eagerly to watch the spectacle. However, after several days, the fortune-teller had done nothing more than eat, drink, sleep, and chat with the servants. Despite his claims of mystical abilities, the ghost never appeared again. One day, Hu Shua decided to take a walk, which led him to the Ingtian Academy. "Mr. Duan," Hu Shua called out with a smile as a young scholar in plain attire came out of the academy. "You're looking for me?" Duan Shulu glanced at the caller. He appeared to be in his 20s, tall and slender, with a handsome and refined face. However, his disheveled appearance, a loose, gray robe, a messy bun, and a look as though he had just woken up, marked him as a disheartened and sloppy fortune-teller. Duan Shulu slightly lifted his head, wearing an air of arrogance on his face. "The beauty has passed away, but Mr. Duan seems to be thriving, with no sign of grief. How heartless," Hu Shua remarked with a playful, teasing tone, causing Duan Shula's face to change at once. What are you talking about? I don't understand." Duan Shulu anxiously glanced around, fearful of being overheard. "The ghost told me everything," Hu Shua shrugged, giving a nonchalant look. "Since you're so forgetful, I'll remind you a little." Before Duan Shulu could stop him, Hu Shua continued, casually detailing events that shook Duan Shulu to his core. "You met Miss Li during last year's Lantern Festival. You two fell in love at first sight, and after that, you exchanged letters. Her family's back garden was desolate, and with the help of a maid, you often met there. Miss Li reached the age of marriage, and she was chosen for the palace, though if she didn't make the selection, she was still promised to a royal heir. In desperation, she arranged a secret meeting with you in the back garden, intending to elope together. Isn't that right?" With each sentence, Duan Shulu grew paler, his forehead covered in cold sweat. The image of the carefree young man he had once portrayed had completely crumbled. In a panic, he grabbed Hu Shua and dragged him to a secluded spot, his face full of desperation. "Please, Mr. Hu, please stop. If you continue, I might as well jump into the Yellow River to clear my name." "Oh," Hu Shua raised an eyebrow, deliberately raising his voice. "You wanted to indulge in romance, not knowing that Miss Li truly wished to elope and spend her life with you. You were too afraid to take responsibility, fearing it would affect your career, so you killed her, disguised it as a suicide. Am I right?" "That's not true." Duan Shulu turned pale, almost collapsing. He began to cry out desperately. "I admit, I was heartless. I failed her love, but she was too naive to think elopement was so simple. If the minister found out, not only would my career be ruined, but my life would be over. But her death has nothing to do with me. I was too scared to meet her that day." After leaving Ingtian Academy, Hu Shua walked with his hands behind his back, gazing up at the sky, lost in thought. The rumor suggested that Miss Li had died from an illness to protect her reputation, but Hu Shua believed it was far from the truth. The official story was that Miss Li had died by suicide, but her death didn't match the story of a girl who was on the verge of eloping. She had no reason to end her life, so it had to be murder. But as a lowly maid, Yutsao couldn't get anyone to believe her. So, she pretended to be the ghost, hoping to convince others that the spirit was seeking revenge, in hopes of revealing the truth behind Miss Li's death. According to her, There had been mutual affection between Miss Li and Duan Shulu. But when Miss Li proposed elopement, Duan Shulu became scared and failed to show up that fateful day. He had even gotten witnesses who could confirm he had been at the academy. This was the version of the story given by the lover, Duan Shulu. But the puzzle seemed incomplete, lacking an important piece. Hu Shua, hands behind his back, continued to ponder. Something still felt off, as though the whole truth had not yet been uncovered. Suddenly, the sound of water flowing caught his attention, pulling him from his thoughts. There was a well by the roadside, where travelers could drink. Feeling thirsty after walking for so long, Hu Shua approached, lowered the bucket, and waited as it filled with water. When the stone counterbalance dropped, he quickly pulled the water back up. Taking a deep drink of the sweet, clear water, Hu Shua immediately felt refreshed. His eyes glanced at the well's mechanism, and after a moment of contemplation, his eyes suddenly lit up, as though he had thought of something. He quickly returned to the Li residence and asked a servant to take him to the back garden. The back garden of the Li residence was a neglected area, overgrown with weeds and left uncared for. Since the ghost rumors had started, the entire household avoided it at all costs. Even under the bright sky, it appeared cold and eerie. The servant, uneasy, followed behind, watching as Hu Shua carefully examined every tree and even knelt down to smell the ground. The servant, unsure what Hu Shua was looking for, shivered with the chilling wind that blew across the garden as dusk approached. When Hu Shua finally stood up, his eyes gleamed like the stars, bright and sharp, as if another person had emerged from the shadows. The night had already deepened past midnight. A ghostly figure, clad in white with flowing hair, moved slowly through the dark. It glided silently, and as its skirts brushed against the ground, a few petals drifted gently to the floor. The ghost slipped noiselessly through a door. The slumbering Li family was suddenly awakened by a piercing scream. "Ah! Help! There's a ghost!" A figure scrambled out of a room, shouting loudly, "Someone, quickly help me!" In her haste, she tripped over the threshold and fell to the ground, desperately crawling forward while constantly glancing behind. Behind her, a shadowy figure stepped into view. The moonlight filtered through the courtyard, just enough to illuminate the outline of the figure. She wore a pale yellow short robe with a cross-collar, a lake blue floral silk skirt, and a pink, half-sleeved outer garment. A long, multicolored silk cord was tied around her waist. Her face was obscured by the darkness, a mere blur. Her eyes locked onto the woman on the ground as she took slow, deliberate steps closer. Ho-da. The woman on the ground trembled, calling out with shaky breaths as she tried to crawl away. But the long skirt had tangled around her legs, preventing her from rising. As the shadow approached, the woman shook uncontrollably, her voice breaking into a desperate wail. Hoda, I didn't mean to harm you. You forced me. Please stop following me. Don't haunt me. Suddenly, a soft cough echoed through the courtyard. Lanterns flared to life, illuminating the scene, revealing a group of people standing in the yard. Li Shirlang and his concubines, along with their relatives, were all there. The one standing at the front was none other than Hu Shua, who bowed to the trembling woman on the ground. "Madam." The moment Li Shirlang's wife saw Hu Shua, a look of relief washed over her. As though she had found her savior, she scrambled to her feet, ignoring her disheveled appearance, and rushed to grab his arm. "Sir, please save me. There's a ghost. "Oh." Hu Shua tilted his head, appearing very serious. "Where's the ghost?" "There, over there." Li Shirlang's wife hastily pointed behind her, but suddenly her words faltered, and she froze in disbelief. The ghostly figure had approached closer. Under the lantern light, the figure was revealed. It was not a ghost at all, but the Mrs. Personal Maid Yu Chao. "You." Li Shirlang's wife stared in shock at her, wide-eyed, then glanced back at Hu Shua and the others in the yard. Suddenly, realization dawned on her, and her face turned ashen. "How could it be you? Why would you harm Hoda?" Li Shirlang, still unable to believe it, pointed at his wife in shock and confusion. Though I am not a talented man, I was entrusted by Lord Li to investigate the cause of Miss Li's death. I have gathered the results, and now I ask for your patience while I explain, Hu Shua said, walking slowly with his hands clasped behind his back. The Mrs. Death was officially declared as a result of illness, but in truth, she died by hanging in the back garden of this manor. After her death, rumors spread that the manor was haunted, and many people claimed to have witnessed strange events. Is this true? Everyone nodded in agreement. I have uncovered that the so-called ghost was actually the Mrs. Maid, Yu Chao. Hu Shua turned to Yu Chao and gave her a gentle smile. Yu Chao, who had been extremely nervous, suddenly felt a strange sense of calm at Hu Shua's smile. She realized there was something reassuring about him. Yu Chao has explained to me that the miss had been in love with a young man named Duan Shulu from the Yingtian Academy. Their love, however, could not be accepted due to differences in social status. As a result, she made a desperate attempt to escape and be with him. On the day of the miss's death, she went to the back garden to meet Duan Shulu, but he, at the last moment, decided not to keep the appointment and did not show up. Hu Shua's words caused an uproar. Stop spouting nonsense, Li Shirlang yelled angrily, stomping his foot. His outrage seemed even greater than before as he pointed at Hu Shua and shouted, Because I have heard that you are knowledgeable about spirits and ghosts, I have treated you with the utmost courtesy. How dare you slander my family, spreading lies and tarnishing the reputation of the Li household? Hu Shua sighed, slightly helpless. His gaze shifted to Li Shirlang's wife, and he asked, Lord, you may not be aware, but surely Madam knows the truth? Seeing her face filled with shock, Li Shirlang's wife shook her head in denial. Hu Shua sighed again and quietly asked, the poem Miss Li carried with her, the one addressed to Duan Shulu, did Madam take it? Her face changed instantly. This piece of paper with an excerpt from the New Jia, Woman's Precepts, was taken from the Miss's belongings. It bears traces of ink marks that are lighter than the writing. I suspect the Miss once wrote on a piece of paper beneath this one and carried it with her. The ink transferred onto the page beneath, leaving different shades of darkness. Since the letter was never given to Duan Shulu and wasn't found on her person, it must have been taken by someone else. That person is the killer, and the motive for the murder is clear: to conceal the Miss's secret love affair. Is what he says true? Li Shirlang turned his trembling eyes to Yu Chao. Yu Chao knelt, tears streaming down her face. Master, it's true. Li Shirlang nearly fainted, his face turning pale with shock, while the concubines scrambled to help him steady himself. Why would you suspect me? Li Shirlang's wife asked, her voice filled with sorrow, and after a long pause, she inquired, if you knew I raised her as my own, would you have doubted me? Of course. I wouldn't have suspected you if you were the Mrs. biological mother. But as you know, her biological mother passed away when she was young. Lord Li, fond of this daughter and with no other children of his own, adopted her and treated her as his own. I learned this from the old servants in the manor. This isn't just gossip, is it? That's right. Hoda wasn't born to me, but I raised her. Li Shirlang's wife raised her voice in protest. She was like my own daughter. Like your own daughter? Hu Shua laughed lightly. The Mrs. bedroom was located far from the main household, isolated from the rest of the house. Yet, she had a tapestry embroidered with 100 flowers. It's clear that she didn't dislike flowers or plants by nature, but she couldn't get close to them. She must have had asthma, right? The scent of pollen and flowers could trigger an attack, which is why she had to stay away. Yu Chao was shocked. She had not expected Hu Shua to deduce the Mrs.'s rare illness, which only a few people knew about. She nodded, feeling a deep sense of admiration. Hu Shua pointed to the lush flowers in the wife's courtyard. But madam, you've planted many exotic flowers here, their fragrance thick and overpowering. You've spent years surrounded by them, and the scent still lingers on you. Knowing full well that the miss had this allergy, you still surrounded her with flowers. You call that treating her as your own. Li Shilong's wife froze, unable to respond. Her face became a mixture of green and white. To be honest, I initially suspected Lord Li. Hu Shua glanced at the panting Li Shiling, but there was no trace of apology in his gaze. The Li family is strict, and the reputation of the family is paramount. If the motive for the murder was to hide the Mrs. Secret love affair, then Lord Li would be the most likely suspect. But since Lord Li saw the ghost and came to me to clear the matter, believing in the supernatural, if he truly felt guilty, he wouldn't have been so open about it. At this point, my suspicion shifted to Madame. Hu Shua's eyes flickered with sharp intelligence. So, I had Yu Chao play the role of the ghost. The ghost in this manner was a fake. The real ghost is the one in people's hearts. That's not right. Someone in the crowd murmured. If the young lady was harmed by the madam, why does it look like a hanging suicide? That's a fair point. Hearing the doubt, Hu Shua laughed instead. There are two main points of suspicion here. First, why, when the coroner examined the body, was there only a strangulation mark on the neck, with no other wounds found? Second, how could a woman alone have the strength to strangle another adult to death? That has been bothering me, until I accidentally found a clue. Hu Shua stretched out his arm, making a gesture for everyone to follow. Please come with me to the scene and let's investigate. Li Residence, rear garden. Only one lantern. The rest should be extinguished. Hu Shua instructed. As the light dimmed, a greenish glow appeared in the distance among the trees. Yusaw, please. Hu Shua nodded toward Yusaw. Yusaw nodded in response and walked towards the greenish light. Upon nearing it, she let out a quiet scream. Light the lanterns. Several lanterns were lit again, and the scene before them caused everyone to gasp in surprise. Yusaw, standing near the trees, had been unknowingly ensnared by a thick rope around her neck. The rope was wedged against a tree branch, with the other end held in Hu Shua's hand. The branch served as a pivot point, forming an angle so that with a single tug of his hand, Hu Shua could lift Yusaw off the ground. As you can see, I tied a slip knot in this rope, passed it over this thick branch, letting it fall to the height just below the neck of a typical woman, and held the other end, hiding to one side. The trees in the rear garden are dense, and the gap between them is so narrow that only one person can squeeze through at a time. All I had to do was lure Yusaw to walk in this direction. Because the space is so cramped, she had to bend forward, and her head would inevitably enter the rope loop. At that moment, I could quickly pull the rope, using the branch as leverage and easily hoist her off the ground. After she died, I would untie the knot and rearrange the scene to make it look like a suicide. With this method, a single woman can easily commit murder. As Hu Shua spoke, he pointed. I found signs of bark wear on this branch and traces of phosphorus powder on the ground nearby. This phosphorus powder doesn't burn at a high temperature, so it won't start a fire, and the flame has a strange color. The murderer used it to lead the young lady step by step into the rope loop. The eerie green light seen by the night watchman was caused by the phosphorus powder burning. The madam of the house turned pale, as though all strength had left her. She collapsed to the ground and buried her face in her hands. Why? Li Shiling clutched his chest, trembling all over, his eyes wide with rage as he looked at the woman who had once shared his bed. The concubines who were supporting him couldn't hide the faint satisfaction in the corners of their mouths. Hu Shua sighed. What else could it be but desire? A gust of wind blew, causing the candlelight to flicker, casting strange shadows on the faces of everyone present. The eerie green light continued to flicker quietly, like eyes returning from the underworld. The case of Li Shilong's daughter's suicide was full of twists and turns, but the truth was eventually uncovered. The madam of the house, fearing her own disgrace would be exposed after discovering her stepdaughter's affair and fearing the consequences from her husband, took ruthless action and killed her adopted daughter. Although there was no blood relation between them, the years of living together under one roof had formed a deep connection, and the stepmother's cruelty was chilling. After the people in the neighborhood gathered to unanimously condemn the madam, their conversation inevitably turned to the mysterious man who had solved the case. It was said that this man had dual pupils and could peer into both the living and the dead, able to communicate with ghosts. When Li Shilong's daughter's spirit lingered in the world, it revealed the truth of her death to this man, which allowed the case to be resolved. In no time, rumors about this strange person spread far and wide, with people flocking to the nameless shop hoping to catch a glimpse of this extraordinary man. But they were all turned away. The doors of the nameless shop were closed tightly, and the legendary fortune teller had disappeared without a trace. Don't wait for him. He won't be back in 3 or 5 days. The tavern keeper leaning against the doorframe said, "Will he return?" "Don't worry. He won't run far. He can't escape." The tavern keeper poured himself a cup of wine, swirling it in his glass, but not drinking it. Instead, he squinted at the hazy sky over Beijing. Inside the tavern on the second floor, Hu Shua sat by the window, gazing at the sky. The dark clouds hung heavily in the distance, and as the wind blew, the rain poured down, rustling against the window. The crowd downstairs scattered, and once again, the nameless shop was deserted. Hu Shua thought back to a month ago, to the figure of the master and servant outside the nameless shop, to the tavern keeper's wine and the sword hidden in his sleeve, and to another pair of warm, cool eyes that had been smiling. The rain pattered against the window, like the gentle sound of a zither. Sitting by the window, Hu Shua curled a finger and gently tapped on the window sill, softly humming something. If you listened closely, you could hear him singing the lyrics of "You May Run." Joy and sorrow are always indifferent, while the drops fall, from dusk till dawn. Joy and sorrow are always indifferent, huh? The case of the haunted Li residence was finally resolved. The persistent autumn rain dampened the spirits of many people. Beijing briefly returned to a calm, yet in this strange and ever-changing world, there would always be a new story waiting to unfold.